over the past few years, we've been taking requests by all different people for what kind of topics of interest do people have. And over again, we've been asked to do a series on Jewish history. Now, Jewish history is longer than our exile. It's thousands of years all over the world and very extensive. And we got some more specific requests that really wanted to learn more about the Hasidic movement and Chabad and where it came from and what it's all about. So this year, instead of medical ethics, we're devoting a series on historical sketches. And what I would like to focus on this season is looking at some of the huge events that precipitated and influenced and set the stage for the Hasidic movement, the initial birth of the Hasidic movement, and then narrowing it down to the development of the Chabad Hasidic movement. And we'll take it as far as we can get this season. So two of the most major events that influenced world Jewry, really, were the Chmielnicki pogroms of 1648 and Shabtai Tzvi, which was a false messiah that appeared shortly afterwards. Those were very, very influential dates that were very important to take into consideration as the backdrop for the birth of the Hasidic movement to help understand the influencers and the challenges the Hasidic movement faced as a result of these two things. So today we're really going to explore the pogroms of 1648. And what I'm going to try doing throughout this series is to try using personal diaries, chronicles, and accounts so that we can have a certain perspective from the people that experienced these events and their recordings. We have the historical documents, but seeing it in people's own words and their own writings, I think, brings it so much more vivid and impacting. So a lot of the details that I will share today are coming from the chronicles of Rabbi Nathan Hanover. He wrote the chronicles of these pogroms in a work called Yeven Mitsula. In English, it's called Abyss of Despair. I would recommend that reading if you want to really get the full flavor of all of the different places. He himself was born in Ostrog, and later on, when he was residing in Zaslav, he was escaping the pogroms that hit the city there. So he himself experienced it, he fled, and then he went around collecting the stories from so many of the survivors and was able to put together the chronicles that he wrote. He was a rabbi, a preacher, a scholar, a judge, and a very prolific writer. And he gives a pretty even-handed perspective, and he looks at some of the things that influence the events, and he describes it. So you have really a very vivid picture from his work. Another interesting chronicle that I used was from the works of the Gluckel of Hamelin. She was a woman from Germany who wrote a diary for her family to basically share with them her life experiences. Now, although she was in Germany, some of these events, like the pogroms and Shabtai Tzvi, the false messiah, these things reverberated all the way to Germany. And she was impacted by the refugees that came to her. Her family attended to some of these refugees. They came with diseases. It was probably tuberculosis. In tending to them, I think it was her mother-in-law that died. Some of them became ill. And she describes the community and how they cared for all these refugees coming in and the funds that were raised. So you hear from these personal portraits of this whole time period. But to begin, the question starts off with what brought Jews to this Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? here was this massive, the largest state in Europe. It was made up of linkages between the dynasties from the Polish and the Lithuanian, and it was a massive area. It covered Ukraine and what we know today as Estonia, Latvia, Poland, Belarus, Ukraine. It was a real large territory. What brought the Jews there? So really beginning with the 11th century Crusades, life in Western Europe became more and more unbearable. There was numerous expulsions. In fact, in France alone, within 1 century, Jews were expelled 3 times. And commonly, this would be the system. The Jews would be a lot of the money lenders, and they would have a line of credit extended to a lot of the leaders. Debt would keep mounting, and instead of paying the debt, the easiest thing to do was expel the Jews, confiscate their possessions, wipe away your debt. Well, expel the Jews, and the economic system and institution of credit went along with them, and pretty soon they needed that again, so they welcomed the Jews back, and the cycle repeated 3 times within 1 century just in France. Then there were ritual murder accusations, blood libels. It became so difficult to just be in one place, to be able to operate, to be able to have commerce without, just having this relentless persecution. So beginning with the 13th century, Jews started emigrating to this area. They did so because the Polish kingdom was religiously tolerant to them and afforded them a lot of freedoms that they had not experienced in Western Europe. In fact, the Polish kingdom kind of welcomed them to stimulate their sluggish, primitive economy, which was a feudalistic system. So beginning with the 13th century and then picking up with the 16th and 17th century, especially from Jews from Germany, it ended up having 20 to 30% of all Jews, of all Jewry, living within this Kingdom Lithuanian Commonwealth. This was exceptionally sensitive after the expulsion of the Jews from Spain and Portugal starting from 1492, that there was a real anxiety and fear with the amount of Jews being expelled, and especially from Germany, people pouring into these Polish communities and in the Ukraine. What the Polish system had at that point in their feudalistic system was known as the arenda system, where you had these noblemen that were wealthy landowners, and especially in Ukraine, where there was this black, rich, fertile soil that all these farmlands, and the noblemen lived in the cities, but they owned all the land. So what they did was they took the peasants, the local Ukrainians, and they put them into serfdom. And while they weren't slaves, they were extremely limited in their freedoms. They were forced to live on that land, forced to have a certain quota of labor that they owed the nobleman. They weren't given permission to marry, and they weren't able to marry without permission, and they had to pay taxes to the nobleman. It was like a tax farming system where whatever you did, a percentage went to the nobleman. Yes?
I thought that during the fortunate due from the expulsion from Spain and Portugal, that most of the Jews ended up in Turkey.
A lot of them did, but the fears propelled a lot of the anxiety from all the expulsions, that people were basically shifting a lot of the Jews over to Poland. So in this system of this feudalistic system, the serfs really had very limited freedoms, and they were heavily taxed. The noblemen were not living necessarily in that area. They were in the cities, partying, associating with themselves and the elites, and the serfs were very oppressed. But the Polish government welcomed the Jews to manage their estates. So who are the ones that were going to collect the taxes and make sure everything was running well would be the Jews that they employed. So a significant percentage of the Jews were used as the managers and tax collectors. So if everything was owned by the noblemen, the bridges, the ponds, the hunting woods, the mills, the water wheels, everything you did was taxed, and that tax collectors were the Jews. The Jews were also traders, peddlers, cobblers, craftsmen, silversmiths. So they served as managers, but they also did all these other trades and really stimulated the economy. Interestingly enough, the Polish government gave the Jews monopoly over alcohol sales. So they were in charge of the production, the distribution, and the sale of alcohol, which was also a very big flashpoint. Think about it. You have these serfs, and they're heavily taxed, and they're tilling and they're farming and they're, all in agriculture, and they're waiting for their harvest. They have to wait to the produce for it to grow and then for it to be harvested and sold. And finally, they have some money. During that whole interim, everything they're doing is basically on a line of credit. So you work in your field, and at the end of the day, you want to have a drink. You go to the tavern, and who has the alcohol? It's the Jew that runs the tavern, and that you have to pay for your drink. You don't have money now because it's the beginning of a season. So you run a tab. By the end of the whole season, when you finally have your money, you're coming back to the tavern and you have a substantial bill. No one likes to pay big bills, especially drinking bills. So this was also a point of contention where you have the Jews and the interaction with these serfs, with the alcohol running. And this didn't mean that the tavern keepers were necessarily rich. The bills weren't always paid. They also had to lease these taverns and pay taxes, etc. So it provided a lot of opportunity economically for the Jews. There were some Jews that became very wealthy and flourished, and there were also many that struggled and were very poor. But it was a society that had all those different classes. Yes.
And they sold alcohol in pints and quarts, and that's where the saying "watch your P's and Q's" came from.
So another little segment of here, as the Jews were getting involved in all this different commerce, was there were a lot of Jewish musicians. In fact, klezmer comes at this point. Klezmer comes from the word klei zemer, types of musical instruments. And the Jews usually carried portable instruments. They weren't lugging heavy pianos. They were, running around with flutes and clarinets and those type of portable, and they developed their own music that incorporated a lot of the rhythms and songs from the surrounding Ukrainian population. The peasants, these Ukrainians, were at this point very illiterate. And the way that they maintained their tradition and culture was they used to have these traveling guitarists that would sing together with them these long, poetic story songs that had all their history and traditions. And they would get together, and it would be an oral tradition that was passed on. I think it was called the Duma. In this songs of the things that were collected, anti-Semitic lyrics were very prominent. And one of the things that drove and really irked the Ukrainians that was found in these songs was references to Jews collecting taxes for baptism, weddings, and funerals. And this seems to be a very controversial piece, because there are many historians that say that this was an accusation and it was something that became part of the propaganda or the PR to rile up the Ukrainians. Others say that no, it was something that did happen. The noblemen that were in charge of these estates had their ways of oppressing the peasants, the serfs, And if they decided that this is what was going to be taxable, then the Jewish people that were collecting those fees, this was something that they had to enforce. In other words, if a serf couple wanted to get married and they needed the keys to the church, they had to pay the tax to the Jew to get the keys. So whether it was an accusation, whether it was something that was done forcibly, voluntarily, how frequently is all controversial, but it was something that really helped rile and stir up the hatred. So you have Jews being employed by the noblemen to manage the estate and to collect the taxes, putting them in an unfavorable position in reference to the Ukrainians. You have in the tax system alone these items that we don't know for certain if they were true or not, but definitely something that they thought was the case in the songs that they sang and in their gatherings. And another important aspect is that the Polish kingdom was Roman Catholic. The Ukrainians were more aligned with the Greek Russian Orthodox. Both of them looked at each other as infidels. So you have the Jews who are the definite infidels, but between the two of them, the Polish Roman Catholic felt more entitled to oppress them because of the religious differences. In fact, some of the noblemen were actually using cruelty and torture to try forcing conversions between the Greek Orthodox towards the Roman Catholics. Within the Jewish community, by and large, the kingdom was very tolerant and they were able to practice their Judaism. But there were definitely noblemen that were anti-Semitic. The Catholic clergy were very anti-Semitic. And there were also Jesuit academies that had their students that occasionally would rile up and have riots against the Jews. In fact, the Jews used to bribe the headmasters of these Jesuit academies to try buying peace and quell and keep their students under control. So it wasn't the most glorious picture, but it was far better than Western Europe. There was a lot of economic opportunity because it was a vacuum beforehand. The Jews definitely stimulated the economy. They were involved in all different types of commerce, yet they were also very careful not to take fields that would be competitive with the nobility. So there was always a very, very careful balance that they had to weigh with their prowess and their abilities and where they wanted to take things and not rocking the boat. They had to deal with anti-Semitism wherever they went, but especially with the serfs, these were the main flashpoints. Another big thing to take into consideration here is that in effort in bringing the Jews into Poland, they were given rights that were really remarkable and unheard of elsewhere. They were given permission to manage and govern themselves so that each municipality, each small community had their own beit din, had their own Judaic rabbinic court. They governed themselves. They were the ones that to decide who should be what in their city, if you could be the shoemaker here. They had someone appointed that was in charge of looking at their measures and weights to make sure things were honest. They were the ones that took care of themselves. By the end of the 15th century, hearing about all these expulsions from Spain and Portugal, there was this sense that something more substantial had to be organized so that they won't fall to the same hostile winds of Rome that were causing these monarchs to expel the Jews. So there was a committee that was formed together, and they decided that instead of each province and each community having to deal with issues on their own, they should have, out of the whole huge Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, they should have a committee, they should have some type of centralized government. And that way they would form a specialized committee to lobby and advocate before the king. And so they put together this, what was called the Council of Four Lands. And the king sanctioned this, and the king allowed for this type of a government so that there was really a whole system, a very sophisticated system of government that united the Jews from all across this huge land. And for there to be such Jewish unity over such a large scope. And some of the things that they engaged in was being tax assessors. They were the ones that collected the taxes from the Jews that would be presented to the king. They were the ones that stipulated the fees. As part of this collection, they had a portion collected for bribes and to take care of business when issues arose between noblemen or areas that had problems. So it was very, very elaborate. They had a lobbying committee, they had a scribe, they had rabbinic court, they had 6 prominent scholar rabbis taken from across the provinces, they had judges that were appointed, so, and they had their lobbying committee. And this Council of Four Lands met twice a year at the fairs in Lublin and Yaroslavl. So in the winter fair and the summer fair, this committee would gather, and they had representatives from all the different communities from across all the lands. And then there was the localized municipalities. They had lay leaders elected, they had boards, they had a parnas, like the executive, they had their own rabbinic courts, and people were welcome to either go to their local rabbinic court for a dispute or to another areas. And if they needed a high court, they had a larger court for in a larger city or province. And if there was an issue between communities, it would be taken up by this Council of Four. They were the ones that would enact ordinances. They would make the policies, things like copyright laws and all different types of things that had to involve how they treated each other, laws that would benefit everybody. And it was a very intricate system that lasted over 100 years with all of them connected. And then even when some of them splintered off because they became so large, like the Lithuanian segment, it took off and was even more successful than the Polish contingency and lasted another 100 years. So this was like a remarkable thing that they were able to literally be sort of like an autonomous state within a state, and that the Polish government allowed all this. Another important little, backdrop to what we need to do to set up and get ready for the horrible pogroms to follow is to understand the role of the Cossacks. The Cossacks were, in this capacity, they were runaway serfs who, we said before that the serfs weren't allowed to leave their land. And here they ran away, they got their freedom, and they were freelance bandits. They situated themselves by the southern east portion of the country near the Baltic, near the Black Sea. And there they would, harass the caravans, the traders, people that would be on that southern eastern tip. And that's how they would support themselves. So they were basically like the Wild West, everything goes, and they had their own groups. Now, the Polish kingdom looked at them and they thought that this was an opportunity because they had the king of the Tartars, the Crimean Tartars, would raid their southern border. So they decided to actually organize the Cossacks to work for them. So they took a specified number of the Cossacks and made them part of their military. They gave them titles of nobility. They gave them all these different rights, freed them of taxes, and they would be working for the Polish kingdom by basically fortifying and patrolling the southern border from the Tartars. In this group of quote unquote nobility Cossacks, it's not exactly 100% clear of this man named Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whether he was initially part of regular nobility that owned land and was a wealthy landowner, or given nobility by being part of this Cossack contingency. But he and his father went out to battle on behalf of the Polish kingdom. His father was killed in battle. He was captured by the Tartars. He was eventually ransomed a few years later. And when he comes back to inherit his father's estate, a different magnate had usurped his land, and he ran to the Polish government trying to plead his case, and to no avail. They didn't want to help him. They didn't want to do anything about him. Other versions of the story is that it wasn't just land, but he was also in competition over a specific woman that he wanted. And this magnate had took off with his wife as well. In this process, he goes and he pleads his case to the king, and the king gives him documents asserting his rights, but no one wants to honor that. No one wants to start up with this magnate, and he's left without land. According to one version, his son is brutally beaten, and he either lost his wife at this time or that wife was taken by the other person, but he's left there with 3 daughters, another son, and no wife, very bittered and looking for revenge. And because the Polish haven't been of use to him, and he went to war for them, and he was captured, and everything that happened, he was out for revenge. Now, the Cossacks, as much as they were warriors and incorporated into the Polish military, the Polish kingdom kept them at bay, kept them very limited. Whoever wasn't part of that limited group of the military were basically the freelance bandits and kind of like on their own. He realized that in order to revolt against the Polish kingdom, he wouldn't be able to do it just with the band of Cossacks. So he made an alliance with the king of the Tartars, and he made a pact with them, which was they were very into captives and selling people on the slave market. So the agreement would be that as they would go to war against the Polish nobility, the Cossacks would get the silver, gold, clothing, whatever you could carry, and the Tartars were free to take whoever they wanted that was captured. That was basically the deal that they set up. And they started initially with, going to revolt against a small Polish little infantry group, and with success, because now they're outnumbering them. And then they take on a larger group of Polish army that were encamped nearby. And it changed the dynamics of everything. Beforehand, any type of uprising was very quickly quelched by the Polish government. They were no match for them. They would try revolting. They would, basically crush them, limit their rights, restrict even more of them from the military, and that was enough to keep them at bay. Now that they had a successful victory against the Polish military, everybody looked at them with awe. They all of a sudden showed that the Polish were not invincible. And with the Tartars and the Cossacks together, they were becoming sizable. By the time the Polish heard and figured out what was going, they had already stirred up a national unrest by all the peasants across the entire area. Here they were finally going to have the leader they all wanted. This Khmelnytsky, Bogdan Khmelnytsky, became the leader, the appointed, the greatest leader they ever had, and he was going to lead the revolt and finally free them from all this Polish oppression. And he stirred up them to go against the Polish nobility, to go against the Jews, who were the ones employed by the Polish, who were also the infidels, and he basically riled them all up. So here you have serfs from all across that were subjugated for hundreds of years, and they are now being given the Cossacks and the Tartars, and they're going to finally win their freedom. What results is absolute barbarism. They went from city to city and literally decimated them, cruelly slaughtering and pillaging, and men, women, children, the Tartars taking whoever they wanted off to captivity, and the peasants and the Cossacks literally just brutally slaughtering every community in its way. This began in the year 1648. In the Jewish calendar, it was 5,408, and therefore the Hebrew letters that have the numerical value, it was the year Taf, Tuf for 400, Ches for 8, for 408, and the first 2 years were the worst beginning stages, and this pogrom was called in Hebrew Gzeres Tach V'Tat, the evil decree that happened in the year 1648 and 1649. On your source sheet here, I've just showing you on the map all the different villages, towns, communities on the map of what was decimated. And here you see a fraction of the places listed on the bottom. You have over 160 or something communities here. The numbers are very, very confusing. It's very hard to know exactly how many people were killed. We know that there were about 20 to 30% of the Jewish population residing in the area. There was less than 10% that remained after nearly 10 years of continuous violence, where somewhere between 300 and 700 communities were completely slaughtered, destroyed, massacred. They didn't only target the Jews, they also killed the Catholic clergy, the noblemen, anyone Catholic and anyone loyal to the nobility. The only option the Jews had was forced conversions. And in many of these towns and villages, the rabbis encouraged the Jews to maintain their faith, and they died sanctifying God's name. There are many different types of stories that have been chronicled of Jews, of how they gave up their lives. There were two stories mentioned by Hanover of women. There was a Cossack that found a really beautiful woman that he wanted to forcibly marry. And she, knowing what a simpleton he really was, convinced him that she had special magical powers and that there would be nothing he could do that could possibly kill her. And she would tease him and jest and say, try it out. Take your gun and shoot it at my heart, and you'll see the bullet could go right through and I'll survive. So he shoots her and she dies. And that was her plan, so that she wouldn't have to submit to him. Another story that he recounts is a woman that is forcibly taken by one of these peasants, and the woman notices that across the bridge there's a church house. And so she says, wouldn't it be the right thing to get married in the church? So he takes her along and he finds some type of person to actually escort them with music on the road to get married at the church. And as soon as she reaches the bridge, she bolts, jumps off, and drowns herself. These were typical type of stories. Most people tried as best they could to flee. There were throngs of people that were just trying to run as fast as they can. They left everything behind. Even a horse and a wagon was considered too bulky. They stripped themselves of all possessions, just running as fast as they could carry themselves to the woods, to other areas. The one Polish account that I saw said that the roads were littered with thousands of slain infants. I mean, it was just massacres. People were skinned alive. It was in the most barbaric ways from city to city. Khmelnytsky himself was a very sly, cunning, talented warrior. He would play everybody against each other, sometimes offering very deceptive truces. There was one story where in one town, the Jews were always allied with the noblemen who were their employers and who were, for the most part, trying to protect them. They would allow the Jews to come with them into the fortresses and some of the walled communities that were there and try repelling the Cossacks. And so in one instance, these noblemen are together with the Jews in this fortress, and the Cossacks offer a truce to the noblemen. If you give us all the booty of the Jews, we'll spare your lives. The Jews understood that this was a ploy, but the Polish noblemen grabbed on the opportunity. They disarmed the Jews, they confiscated all of them, and they give it over to the Cossacks. In that community, the Jews realized that they outnumbered the noblemen, and they had this fortress. So there was this thought that maybe they should take revenge on the noblemen that betrayed their pact and still stave off the Cossacks. But one of the leading rabbis of that community told them that even if they would have a chance of sparing themselves, it would cause havoc for other Jewish communities, because word would get back that the Jews were betraying the noblemen, and then the noblemen wouldn't be protective and helping the Jews in other communities. So there was always this sense, not just of your own life and in your own community, but what would be the ramifications for Jews all around that were in similar situations, or how would this impact others? So in that scenario, the Jews ended up being given over to the Cossacks, and then the Cossacks turned on the noblemen and said, you betrayed the Jews, and now you're gonna be betrayed as well, and they slaughtered them as well. So they had so many different types of situations where Khmelnytsky really played up to his advantage all the different type of politics that went on even within the Polish nobility. He knew that there was once one of the very talented dukes. He was an exceptional warrior, and he was very, very successful in winning against the Cossacks. He convinced the king of the Tartars to release some of the generals that they had held captive, because he knew that if those generals would be released, they would be able to replace this duke in prestige and having their positions, and that way he wouldn't have to worry about the duke ascending to a more powerful and position. So he was able to really affect a lot of the internal politics with the nobility. He himself, when he needed the Tartars, he went to the Tartars. Eventually, he made pacts with the Swedes. He made pacts with the Russians. He was considered a national hero for many of the Ukrainians who saw him as their big liberator, although some of them had problems with the fact that he sided with Russia, because Russia was all too happy to eventually swallow Ukraine as like their little brother. But wherever he had a chance to continue his fight and make alliances, he was very adept. He was held prisoner quite a few times, and he was always able to outmaneuver and get himself out. But along the way, he basically decimated all of the Jewish communities. In the city of Nimirov, which was one of the initial places that the pogrom started, the pogrom started on the 20th day of Sivan, and that day that marked such a rampage that the estimates are that about 6,000 Jews were murdered in that city alone. This day was regarded as a day of fasting for the Jews, to remember this Holocaust of sorts. And this fast day was kept for nearly from the time period of 1648 until the Holocaust. That Chav Sivan was a day of fasting to remember all of what happened to all the Jews in those towns. There were other ordinances that people had. It was like such grieving. People didn't play music. People limited their celebrations for a full year afterwards. I'm just going to bring some of the quotations that you have on the other side of the source sheets. This was taken from the town of Nimirov, what Hanover is describing. Number one, some were skinned alive, their flesh thrown to dogs. Some had their hands and limbs chopped off, bodies thrown on highways to be trampled by wagons, crushed by horses. Some had wounds inflicted upon them and thrown on the street to die a slow death. They writhed in their blood until they breathed their last. Others were buried alive. The enemy slaughtered infants in the laps of their mothers, sliced into pieces like fish. They sliced the bellies of pregnant women, removed their infants, tossed them in their faces. Women had their bellies torn open, live cats placed in them. Bellies were then sewn up with the live cats remaining within. They chopped off the hands of the victims so they wouldn't be able to remove the cats from their bellies. Infants were hung on the breasts of their mothers. Children were pierced with spears, roasted on fire, and brought to their mothers to be eaten. Bodies of Jewish children as improvised bridges upon which they later crossed. There was no cruel device of murder in the whole world that was not perpetrated by the enemies. All the 4 death penalties, stoning, burning, beheading, strangling, were meted out by the Jews. Many were taken by the Tartars into captivity. The Jews themselves said, if we wait until the Ukrainians invade, we will perish and be forced into baptism. Preferable for us would be to fall captive to the Tartars, because we know that our brethren in Constantinople and the other Turkish communities are compassionate and they'll ransom us. This they did, and the 4 above mentioned communities surrendered to the Tartars, men, women, and children, some 3,000 souls. In fact, besides the people, scrolls were torn into pieces, turned into boots and shoes on their feet. Straps of the phylactery served as laces. The leather boxes were cast into the streets. Other sacred books served to pave the streets. Some were used for kindling, others to stuff the barrels of their guns. The ears ring hearing this. And he goes on, talking about situations of starvation, deprivation, disease, hunger, people having to resort to eating off the slain bodies. Literally, so much of this is reminiscent of the Holocaust. This was, for the Jews, a Holocaust. It was the most devastating thing that happened. It was shocking to the whole world. There was not a family that didn't have people killed, orphans and destitutions. They were robbed. There was nothing left of all these communities. I want you to definitely leave with the feeling of how devastating this pogrom was. The series of pogroms and violence that really lasted for close to 10 years. At one point, there was the Polish king said anyone that was forcibly converted can freely go back to their original religion. And of course, many of the Jews did that. There were Jews that were able to forcibly take back their children that were captured by the Ukrainians, that were forcibly converted, and bring them back to the Jewish people. Many of these women that were taken by the Cossacks forcibly escaped and came back as well. Most of the Jews, that were fleeing, went to all different areas in Western Europe and the North and everywhere. But there were also those that felt that it was more dangerous reaching other communities that were having hard times absorbing everyone than trying to go back and rebuild. It took them up close to 50 years to rebuild themselves to some pace. But on the one hand, I want you to really absorb the enormity of what happened. But I also want you to think about what Hanover describes as the period of what life was like right before these pogroms. And he really describes a state of such rich Torah knowledge. This was like the heart of Jewish scholarship. Letters and communications from all around the world were sent to Poland, to these academies, for people to answer questions in Jewish law. And he gives a very vivid account of what it was like. He said that every community had this head of an academy of scholars. And this head was sponsored by the community. And his job was every single day to come to the academy and give discourses to the scholars in the formula known as a pilpul, which was a very elaborate discourse where you bring a bunch of scenarios supported by verses, and you find what the similarities are, then you find the seeming contradictions and things that don't seem to fit, and you need additional layers of support and why it does resolve it, why it doesn't resolve it, and it goes on layers and layers and layers in a very elaborate, logical, meticulous fashion. And you had to be very skilled, very knowledgeable to produce one of these masterpieces of scholarship. And this is what they engaged in. They learned Talmud, about a page of Talmud every single day with all their commentaries. In the academy, every scholar would approach this head with all their questions, and each scholar was assigned 2 boys to teach. And every week there was tests. And if you didn't know your answers, you were flogged and you were chastised. And then on Shabbos, the head of the academy would test you. But every household in the community was responsible to host a scholar and 2 boys for all 3 meals a day throughout the year. So at breakfast, lunch, and supper, you had this engagement of all these, the talks of the Talmud and the discussion that would be part of your daily, meals. This is in every single house. Then they had a system of prayers where before dawn they had Shomrim Laboker, people that would be praying for the morning of the temple. Then you had Chevras Tehillim, people that said psalms for an hour before prayers. And he writes, it was unheard of for people not to be on time for prayers. So everybody attended prayers. After prayers, no one left to work before spending time learning with the scholars in the shul. So there were so many scholars that you had a full range of topics. And immediately after davening in the morning and in the evening, people stayed and studied. So imagine this type of a lifestyle where morning, evening, and throughout the day, people are learning, and how much Torah study is going on and on. The students learned every day of the year, and for a few weeks of the year, their freedom was they were able to choose which academy they would attend. The head of the academy with the scholars, with the students would all go together twice a year to the fair. And all women, children, daughters, everyone would get dressed up and attend these fairs. Hundreds of matchmaking happened at these fairs. And he writes that the wealthy people were always searching for the scholars for their daughters. So they would be very involved in sponsoring the teachings of students that were aspiring. And if there was a scholar, they would promise large dowries, and they would take these students even after they got married and they were scholars. They would open up these little academies in their homes. So they would invite more scholars into their home to really help their son-in-law become more and more proficient, hoping that one day he would also be the head of one of these academies. The head of the academy, this big Rosh, was revered, admired. What he said was law. He decided what's kosher, what's not, what should be. They said he held a lash and a whip to chastise or to actually smite any transgressors, but he was loved, he was respected, he was given all honors at every ceremony, always called up to the Torah. No one was allowed to leave shul before him. He left first, followed by all his pupils and scholars and students, together with the whole congregation, escorted him home. On holidays, they would stop and at their home, and he would greet each of them. He was supplied with fatted fowl, good fish, and capons. And he was given gifts of silver and gold. He was lavished with a really robust salary, living expenses, and he was revered. He was the top scholar. And Hanover said this created such motivation for all these students. They wanted to eventually be able to be such a Rosh, such a person that could head an academy. So even if their intentions for the wealth, for the honor, for the glory was not necessarily for the sake of heaven initially, once they were committed, once they were involved, once they were entrenched in the study, their perspective shifted, and the intentions shifted with it. But this was the type of atmosphere of such robust learning. Some of our greatest Torah scholars, their writings are what we study today. Shapsai Cohen, the Shach, his commentary on the Code of Jewish Law. So many of the big scholars, what we learn today is from this time period. The books and the things that they wrote. The generosity that they had in these communities, how they took care of each other. Guests were always welcome and treated properly. They were given provisions and escorts and food. They made sure that people that wanted trades would be set up with apprentices. They really took care of each other. So he describes Torah and kindness to be such important factors for these communities. So you have, on the one hand, immense scholarship. The scholars were like the royals. They were the icons of the whole society. The rich were looking for the scholars as son-in-laws. That's why I brought a quote that was very popular at the time, comes from the Talmud. He who loves rabbis will have sons who are rabbis. He who honors the rabbis will have rabbis for son-in-laws. He who stands in awe of the rabbis will himself be a rabbinical scholar. This was the fervor. This was the aspirations. So when we get to the next segments, these are the things that you want to keep in mind, was really the mindset, that the reverence, the attention, the focus was on scholarship and Torah study. These were the big aspirations and the leaders of the communities, and you see with the pogroms how much they respected their opinions. And at the other hand, you want to see how at the conclusion of these pogroms, there is such devastation that there's no money left for any support of any of these institutions. All there is survival mode, orphans, food, shelter, people that are ravaged with diseases, rebuilding. Everything that was before is completely rebooted for survival mode. Okay, so
Quick question.
sure.
In prior to the Inquisition, a lot of scholarship was Sephardic. And of course, many of those Jews went into Morocco and Turkey and so on. Was there scholarly interchange between Sephardic communities and?
Yes, there is a lot. And next week, when we talk about Shopsite Tzvi, where there's a lot of the influence from the explosion of knowledge of Kabbalah. And in the Sephardic communities, that's very, very popular. And in areas in Israel, especially Tzfas was the headquarters of where a lot of this was produced. So Kabbalah and mysticism was something that was very popular in the Sephardic communities, and it was making its way into this area. And it's really the events of Shopsite Tzvi that bring a lot of skepticism and people feeling very uneasy about some of this type of a scholarship. But definitely these works and these scholarships are being, passed along, and in the age of such thirst for knowledge, where people are starting to print things and things are traveling. And here you even see that in the communities of Turkey, that's where in Constantinople and Salinka is where a lot of the Jews were being ransomed. So you have a lot of interchange where they have to redeem these captives, and how much fundraising is going and where they're supporting each other. So different communities definitely were mobilizing.
I was struck by the boys being treated harshly, and I hear about that, even up to the modern day, that they're
Well, you see, even like
the wrong answer or humiliated.
right, but the idea of, I guess in a certain sense, this type of punishment for neglect or not doing things properly was probably the system of consequences. I'm sure the same thing happened if people were disobedient. Like this was how people,
Yeah.
it wasn't like what we have today.
Like progressive education. Yeah.
I think that even if you look back one generation, people will remember being beaten and slapped around and paddled, teachers hitting with rulers. So this is quite a few hundred years ago. This was the discipline. And at the same time, Hanover, well, you see that Hanover also mentions how at the same time that these people were revered, they were also really loved and admired. So the question was, I'm sure different teachers had different relationships, like how often was it used? When was it necessary? Was it really, so harsh? I'm sure it also had to do with the position of the teachers and what kind of scenarios they have. I would imagine that after the pogroms and all the trauma and all the people that were, what they were dealing with and how they survived, I could see that any type of education that was given afterwards that was, kind of like cobbled together would be not necessarily the most experienced teachers, not necessarily the most talented people, that like anyone that didn't have a job or anyone that could offer something may have been mobilized. And I would imagine that in those times afterwards, the system would be even more harsh.
Yeah, no, I know from my experience how my grandfather talked to me. It would never be, it's not a thing.
Yeah, but especially after all the persecutions and like the trauma, the anxiety, the fears, that kind of like sets a certain tone that creates certain personalities that, you know, the tension, the stress, the anxiety, this is not calm, chilled, you know, the lifestyle is harsher. People are more pressured. So I would think that, especially after the pogroms, any little haters that were set up, any type of learning institution probably was ever more rigid, had probably, you know, more selectivity. There was going to be much more gaps between classes and and more poor people and less people that had the opportunities to learn and the divisions. It was definitely going to be a much harsher climate.
The Tartars, I believe, are Muslim.